As was mentioned, I'm Kelly. I'm the clinical supervisor at Dilworth Center, right around the corner from here. In the Food Lion parking lot on Park Road, tucked back behind there. You may not even know we're there. In a beautiful building serving families affected by substance use disorder, which is kind of the clinical verbiage for addiction. We've been in Charlotte for 33 years, and I've been at the Dilworth Center for 10 years now. So I primarily work with adolescents and young adults and their families. And so today we're just going to talk about kind of what's out there in terms of substance use and abuse in adolescent populations. And then based on kind of knowing what our children might be exposed to or have an opportunity to use, what can you as parents do? I've really, over the past 10 years, kind of collected questions that I get often from parents over and over again in the community and threw them into a PowerPoint with some answers. So hopefully this is helpful for you guys. I really wanted to start off by just kind of, again, saying what's out there because it's constantly changing. Even though this is my specialty, I am constantly learning about new drugs and ways of using, and my patients are also my teachers. So most of these drugs are going to be familiar to you in some way, shape, or form. Those top three I put as the top three because those are probably what your children are going to be exposed to first. And arguably, we can kind of identify with that back in our generations too. These are the most accessible drugs, both from a stigma perspective as well as just from like an availability perspective. Still, alcohol is the #1 used and abused substance among adolescents. I think a lot of our society would think that marijuana has risen to the top of that list, but it's still alcohol as the #1 substance, largely because most homes have alcohol in it. So again, it's easily accessible, something that they can just give a try. And just societally, it's really it's the only drug on this list that is overall legal recreationally. Obviously, marijuana is becoming legal in many states, but it's not legal here. And so that is a barrier for people of all age, but definitely adolescents. Marijuana is a completely different drug today than it was back in our day, regardless of what age you are in this room. It is a really potent drug now. I think it's really important to acknowledge that any research that came out saying marijuana was not an addictive substance has since been eradicated. Unfortunately, Big Pharma paid for some of those research articles to be published, and they've since been proven false. So marijuana is absolutely an addictive substance. Actually, the addiction rates of marijuana are higher than the addiction rates of alcohol, which we know objectively alcohol is a very addictive substance. But today, kids aren't just smoking a little bit of flower in terms of their marijuana use. We're seeing a lot of knockoff substances that are a little bit more accessible to our adolescent population. So you'll see over beside the marijuana, I put things like wax, CBD, Delta-8, Delta-10. If you walked into a smoke shop today, there's vape shops popping up all over the place. You can see like they literally have marijuana leaves on them. If you walk into one of those shops today, you will be able to legally purchase Delta-8, Delta-10, and CBD. If we think about the active ingredient in THC, which is what we get high from with marijuana, the active ingredient is actually the chemical compound of Delta-9. So even if you have very limited chemical knowledge, you can kind of understand that Delta-8 and Delta-10 are basically just very similar to Delta-9, a little bit off of the chemical compound. Unfortunately, it's basically a loophole. So there's no rules and regulations over Delta-8 and Delta-10. And so they're able to legally sell them in vape shops. They get you high, very similar to Delta-9, THC, marijuana. So I would say, particularly in the past probably 2 or 3 years, most of the kids that are coming to me addicted to marijuana are actually using Delta-8. That's the most accessible drug in Charlotte because they can legally purchase it, or someone can legally purchase it for them. There are age regulations. 21 is typically the age of legal purchase in North Carolina and in Charlotte. However, there's a lot of vape shops that will sell to kids under 21, unfortunately. So that's probably the biggest addiction that we are seeing with adolescents in the Charlotte community. When I say adolescents, I'm specifically talking about 17 and below, but really arguably up to 19, we're seeing a lot of addiction with marijuana. We're seeing alcohol use and abuse. We're not seeing the addiction rates of alcohol quite as high for adolescents. We're seeing the addiction rates of marijuana, Delta 8 kind of products, a lot higher. One of the things that's come to my attention recently, we had kind of unfortunately a rash of kids who got caught in some schools around Charlotte recently using CBD gummies. That's what they were saying they were using. They were telling their parents that they were CBD gummies. They were actually Delta 8 gummies, and there's a big difference between Delta 8 and CBD. So again, if we go back to THC, which is what we get high from in marijuana, that's Delta 9. CBD is a separate substance that is gleaned from the marijuana plant. It is not a mood or mind altering substance. So CBD in and of itself will not get you high, whereas Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10 will get you high. CBD actually has a lot of really amazing medicinal qualities. So when we look at the kind of legal movement for marijuana, a lot of the rallying was behind the medical benefits of marijuana. The medical benefits do not come from the active ingredient Delta 9. They come from the active ingredient CBD. So actually, CBD in and of itself is a really safe substance. Unfortunately, there's no FDA regulations around CBD. And so when people are selling CBD products, they don't have to disclose to you what else is in those substances. So we're seeing a lot of people of all ages, but especially kids, get CBD gummies or vapes or whatever, and it has a lot of other chemicals that are making them sick. Also, most CBD products have THC in them. And so even as an adult, like if you're using CBD gummies or CBD tincture oil to help you go to sleep, if you were to take a drug test for a new job, you actually could test positive for THC because again, they don't have to report to you as long as the THC is under a certain amount. They don't have to report to you that that's in the substance. So even if you're buying a CBD product that says 0% THC, the likelihood of that being true is not very likely. Tobacco, nicotine, obviously still a very widely used and abused substance. We'll see in a slide in a moment that actually cigarette use has decreased significantly with adolescents. I unfortunately think that's because vaping use has increased a lot with adolescents. So in terms of the number of adolescents using some kind of nicotine product, it's about the same. Just the way that they're using it is a little bit different these days than the way we might have used it in our past generations. That next category of drugs, the benzodiazepines, opiates, and amphetamines are largely prescription medications. These are all medications that are addictive substances that can be used and abused. Luckily, we're not seeing a whole lot of benzodiazepine use with adolescents. These are anxiety medications, sleep medications. You may or may not recognize some of those names: Xanax, Klonopin, Ambien, Ativan. We're seeing more use of those substances in young adult populations. Luckily, there's not a lot of doctors who will prescribe those kinds of medications to adolescents. They're just a little bit harder for them to access on the street, if you will. So that's not a massive problem, at least in this area with adolescents. Opiates, on the other hand, is definitely part of the epidemic. You'll hear that a lot in the news, the opioid epidemic. We are still seeing rising rates of opiate use and abuse in our adolescent, younger populations. One of the really common stories that we hear with adolescents is that their first introduction to opiates was when they got their wisdom teeth out. So we're hearing a lot of kids coming to us saying, you know, a year and a half ago, I got my wisdom teeth taken out and the doctor gave me 30 hydrocodone and I loved how it made me feel. Like, yes, it made the pain go away for like a day or two, but then after that, I really didn't have much pain. I just really liked how the medication made me feel. And that kind of sparked in their system this addictive behavior to try to seek that substance ongoing. So one of the things as parents that you can do if you've got kiddos who are experiencing minor surgeries, that opiate medication can be avoided, which wisdom teeth absolutely does not merit a full-blown opioid prescription unless there is some kind of complications. There are exceptions to that rule, but just kind of a general, I got my wisdom teeth taken out, even if they were a little bit impacted, you don't need a full-blown opioid prescription for that, certainly not 30 days. So that's something as parents that you can advocate for your children to do the Tylenol, ibuprofen, switch off for a few days and see if that's enough so that they don't have that introduction. One of the things we're going to talk about addiction is sometimes we can't stop the progression of addiction or the start of addiction. Sometimes it's a biological thing. And so if we can kind of stop that first use, that's a really amazing intervention in and of itself. Because sometimes once the first use has happened, that gets the ball rolling. And that's really kind of the beginning of the end, if you will. Other drugs on there, again, are really heavy duty drugs, things like fentanyl. We're hearing that a lot in the news. There's a lot of fentanyl overdoses occurring. More and more of all of these substances, honestly, that you're buying on the street, including marijuana, are laced with fentanyl, which is a really potent opioid. So we're seeing a lot of overdose rates with fentanyl in our area. Again, probably more the young adult population, but we've seen it creeping down into our younger populations, particularly because some of these lower level drugs, if you will, have been laced with the fentanyl by the drug dealers. Kratom is another drug that you can buy legally in a lot of gas stations. Charlotte proper has put some interventions on gas stations selling them, but all you have to do is go towards like Gastonia or kind of right outside of Charlotte proper. You can buy Kratom in gas stations. It's sold in drinks and like a tea that you can make, and it's an opiate. It synthesizes an opiate high. It's marketed a lot of times as something that can help you get off of opioids, but it's a very addictive substance. Again, we're not seeing it quite as much in our adolescent populations, but definitely still something that's accessible. Amphetamines is a big one. We are seeing a ton of amphetamine use and abuse in our adolescents. I need to update my knowledge on the 2022 data, but as of 2021, North Carolina was the most overprescribed state in all of the 50 states when it comes to amphetamines. So we are seeing a ton of our kids prescribed things like Adderall, Focalin, Concerta, Ritalin, Vyvanse. All of these are basically meth in pill form. And I know that that sounds really scary. I think it's really important in all of these conversations that I have, you're never going to hear me say drugs are bad, don't do drugs, because that's not the reality. There are benefits to all of these drugs on this list. There are reasons to use them that can help us. And for a kid who truly has ADD or an adult who truly has ADD or ADHD, these amphetamines can be amazing for our brains. A brain with ADHD works kind of the opposite as a brain without ADHD. So when we put an amphetamine in a brain without ADHD, it kind of pumps us up. It gives us energy. If we put amphetamines in a brain with ADHD, it slows us down, it helps us focus, it calms us. So it's going to have an opposite effect, particularly in the appropriate dose. However, many kids are out there taking amphetamines when they don't need them and they don't actually have ADHD. Again, in a moment, I'm going to have a slide talking about pandemic use changes since the pandemic. And ultimately, what we will see is that there hasn't been any massive shift in the amount of adolescents using substances since the pandemic, but I can say what we have seen is a massive shift in the number of adolescents who are coming to us with an ADHD diagnosis. And I put that in quotes because most of these kids are just experiencing trouble focusing, trouble kind of being calm in settings like school or church, etc. But they don't really get psych testing. So it's not like an actual formal diagnosis. It's a situation where they go to their pediatrician or their therapist and say, hey, I'm having trouble focusing. And that provider says, okay, let's try some amphetamines and see if those help you. That's not an official diagnosis. To get an official diagnosis, you have to go through a formal psych evaluation. It's normally about a 2 to 3 day process. It's a really intense evaluation. That ultimately can result in a formal diagnosis, and from that formal diagnosis, recommendations for treatment and therapy and medications can be made. But we're seeing a huge increase in these kids with these diagnoses because of lots of things that the pandemic created. So, for example, isolation in kids during the pandemic and then plopping them back in a school environment where they're expected to learn how to connect with their peers and feel comfortable in that environment created impulsive decisions, acting out, depression, anxiety, those kinds of things. Screen time increased dramatically over the pandemic for all ages, but especially adolescents. And so what we know about screens and kind of the way that a lot of media works is that it's really fast and really impulsive and it lights our synapses up. and kind of keeps us addicted to those fast-paced experiences. And so when we have to go then to school and sit for an hour listening to a teacher and it's not fast-paced and it's not exciting, our brains have to adjust to that. And it's a really difficult adjustment. So a lot of kids are having trouble readjusting to the school environments. They don't actually have ADHD. It's just really a transition that needs to occur within their brains and their bodies. So as parents, one of the things that you can do if your kids are coming to you saying that they're having trouble focusing, or maybe even the school is coming to you and saying, hey, so-and-so's like acting out a little bit, or we're noticing that he's not able to focus on his work, get them in with a therapist before we go to medication. A lot of times we go straight to medication because that's an easy fix, right? It's going to make it better right away. But most people don't actually need that medication. Most people need behavioral interventions. And then down the line, if the behavioral interventions are not helping, then we talk about medication. We get that psych testing, we make sure it's a formal diagnosis, and then we go towards medication. So again, just not jumping straight to the quick fix and really kind of committing to the slower, but also maybe more sustainable process of change. Cocaine is something that we're seeing some in our adolescents, not quite as much. We're seeing that more in college populations. And then those bottom three are definitely things that we're seeing in our adolescent populations. I would say probably about 80% of the adolescents that I see have tried some form of LSD or mushrooms. That second bullet point, I put research chemicals ? Because most of the LSD that's circulating, particularly in adolescent populations, is not actually LSD. It's just a bunch of random research chemicals that some dealer in their house sprayed on a tab and sold as LSD. So really difficult because we don't know how it's going to react in the brain and the body. There's no regulations, obviously, on that. We're seeing a lot of kids experience psychosis from LSD, end up in the hospital, and they can't get out of that psychosis. So they're kind of stuck in the trip, if you will, because these research chemicals are so erratic in their brains and bodies. And then ecstasy, MDMA, Molly. Molly is kind of the way that the kids are using it these days. It's all the same drug. Again, we're not seeing much of that in adolescent populations. It's more kind of a rave or like a festival party drug that we're seeing more in young adult populations. So that's kind of generally what's out there. I know that's a lot of information. I think the good news, like I said earlier, if you can see this, Monitoring the Future is an amazing study that we do in the United States every year. They assess thousands of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders across the country on their drug use and abuse trends. It's been going on for like 30 plus years, and this was specifically focused on the pandemic. This data takes us up to the end of 2021. So I don't have the data through the end of 2022 yet. It takes about 10 months for them to collect and suss out all of that data. So that should be coming out soon. But basically what was found is there were no massive changes. That red line is kind of the standard level of use prior to the pandemic, and those dots are the changes that we've seen since the pandemic. So it's really quite minor in terms of decreasing or increasing in terms of the amount of use or frequency of use for adolescents with different substances. Again, cigarette use being the one that decreased the most, but unfortunately that balances out with vaping use increasing. I get that question a lot, like, what has the pandemic done? Are you seeing so many more patients because of the pandemic? And really, we aren't. We aren't seeing some massive increase in the number of patients. What we are seeing is an increase in the acuity of their mental health. So stronger levels of anxiety, depression, those kinds of things. But not a massive increase in the number of people needing help necessarily. I've talked about this word addiction. We're going to dive into that a little bit more in a moment. But I think as parents and as family systems, it's really important for us to be educated on what makes us as humans more susceptible to developing addiction. I mentioned earlier that for some, it's a biological aspect that we really can't intervene on. It's going to happen. And so the intervention needs to come with allowing that person to get help or encouraging that person to get help at some point. But as humans, like I check a lot of these boxes. I've known my whole life since I was very young that I have a really high susceptibility to developing addiction. And so if I don't go out experimenting with all of the drugs, then maybe I won't find the drug that lights that up in my brain that causes the progression of addiction. So kind of knowing this may or may not encourage a child to not go to that experimenting phase of their life. So adverse childhood experiences, ACE scores, if you've not heard of that, that's something that you can easily look up. But basically, it's any chaotic, traumatic experiences in our life. So things on that list are like if our parents are divorced, if we have an alcoholic parent in the home, those kinds of things are on that list. A lot of them are traumatic experiences that we might experience in childhood, but really arguably any traumatic experience that we have in childhood, these things increase our susceptibility to developing addiction. Any co-occurring disorders that are diagnosed. So these things that we've already talked about, ADHD, anxiety, depression. If we think about what these mental health disorders are at their most basic form, again, just really simple biology, anxiety is a misfiring of neurotransmitters in our brain. There's either too much or too little, or our brain isn't absorbing it the way that it needs to be absorbing it for us to not have that feeling, that debilitating feeling. If you think about drugs and alcohol, all those are putting synthetic neurotransmitters in our brain. So if we already have a misfiring or a misabsorption of those neurotransmitters in our brain, and then we put a whole bunch of synthetic neurotransmitters in our brain, we can kind of see how those things would probably clash with each other and maybe even feed each other. So those increase our susceptibility. Family history of addiction or alcoholism, whether it's diagnosed or treated or not. If we have it on one side of our family, when I say family history, I'm talking great-grandparents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, that kind of close-ish, but extends back a little bit in our family. If we have it on one side of our family, it increases our chances 50% of developing addiction. If we have it on both sides of our family, it increases it 75%. So it's a really, really big predictor. I would say, again, probably 95 to 99% of the patients that we treat at Dilworth Center have a family history of addiction or alcoholism in their families. Age of first use is really important. So the younger we are, the more likely we are to develop addiction. When I say age of first use, that includes prescription medications. So if we have a third grader who's prescribed Adderall for the first time or Vyvanse for the first time, that's age of first use. If we have a 5-year-old who has a major accident and is prescribed an opiate to help control their pain, that's age of first use. Some of those things we cannot help. It's just really important to know and to educate, like, hey, buddy, you had this major surgery when you were really young. And so I just need you to know that that was your age of first use. And we just need to be careful when it comes to experimenting. That kind of conversation is really important. Same thing with family history. When we have addiction in our families, we like to sweep that under the rug, not talk about it. Oftentimes there's guilt and shame in the family system about the family history. So important to break through that and to be open and honest with our loved ones, especially our children, if we do have that family history, because that education can be so essential in the choices that then they ultimately make. And then the last one is concussions. So brain injuries of any sort increase our susceptibility to developing addiction. Of course, if our brain is compromised and we are putting substances that largely impact our brain in our body, again, we can kind of understand why that would increase our susceptibility to developing addiction. So like athletes, you see a lot of it. We actually have a contract with the NFL because there are so many professional athletes out there who have had traumatic brain injuries and ultimately experience high levels of addiction rates. That might be kind of hard to see, but just thinking about what addiction is. A lot of times I think our society thinks of an addict as like a homeless person under the bridge who has lost everything. And the reality is addiction does not discriminate. Addiction affects people of all ages, socioeconomic status, race, sexual identity or orientation, gender identity or orientation, doesn't really matter. It doesn't discriminate. So when we talk about addiction or the progression of addiction, really what we're looking for is continued use despite negative consequences, and ultimately those consequences impacting multiple areas of our life. So for an adolescent, for example, I saw an adolescent today for the first time, and he was really open and honest with me that his use has negatively impacted his grades at school. It's decreased the trust within his family. It's broken up romantic relationships with him in the past. It's isolated him from his friends. It's made it difficult for him to maintain a job, right? So all of these things we're starting to see, it's impacting not just one area of my life, but multiple areas of my life. And I've continued using, even though I have some understanding and awareness that this is what's happening. So as parents, things to look for is isolation from friends or changing friend groups. That's a big one that we oftentimes see. Decrease in interests. So, a soccer star their whole life, and then all of a sudden in 10th grade, they have no interest in joining the team, those kinds of things. Decrease in grade or school performance is definitely a big one. So really just kind of any big shift that's out of the norm, maybe in a negative way for your child. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have addiction, but those are just things to look out for, particularly if sprinkled in there every couple of months, you're catching them with weed, or you're realizing that they stole the alcohol from your cabinet or whatever. So if you've got that information that use is going on in the midst of all of this, that might indicate that this might be something that's happening for them. Ultimately, kind of end stage addiction or end stage substance use disorder looks like us losing everything. So we certainly have patients at Dilworth Center who are coming to us divorced, having lost custody of their kids, jobless because they can't maintain a job, homeless because they can't maintain a job, so they don't have income to live anywhere. So that certainly can be an end result in addiction. But there is something that a lot of times people will consider functioning alcoholism. I would argue that's a lot of what we treat at Dilworth Center. We are private insurance, in the middle of Dilworth. So most of our patients are doctors and attorneys and real estate agents and stay-at-home moms and people who are, to the outside world, very functioning and successful and all of those things. But what it's affecting is, their mental health is completely destroyed. Their relationships are really negative. Maybe work performance is slipping a little bit, but they're able to keep some things up so that people don't catch on. That still is alcoholism. So again, that's maybe an adult example, but just because your kids' grades are still A's and B's doesn't necessarily mean that substances aren't a concern if some of these other things are happening. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing experience. And I sent this email to Laura. So if you guys want, this PowerPoint, sorry. So if you want a copy of this, feel free to reach out to her. You're welcome to distribute to anyone if you want to kind of review it later. So, I think the question on the table is, what as parents can you do? I've sprinkled a couple things throughout today, but these are a few really important things for you to consider. The first one is setting boundaries in your household. And boundaries are not rules. Boundaries are not expectations. I have a lot of parents who come to me who say, well, they know they're not supposed to use, but that's a rule or an expectation. A boundary is basically you setting a statement of what is or is not acceptable in your home based on you, based on your values and morals, based on what helps your mental health, based on what makes you feel good, not about your kid, about you. And then once you have made that really clear, setting consequences if you're a child or your loved one or whoever it is. You can do this with your spouses, you can do this with your adult parents, you can do it with anybody. But once you've set that limit, this is what's acceptable to me and this is what's not acceptable to me, then there are consequences if you fall outside of whatever that is that's acceptable to me. So that's really what a boundary is. A boundary is about you. A boundary is not about forcing an outcome or a choice for your child. I think a lot of times as parents, we are taught, we learn, or we decide that we are going to set these rules and limits with the expectation that our child abides, obeys, follows. The goal being that we control an outcome for our child. We make them make the choice that we want them to make. And at the end of the day, adolescents are very independent thinkers. They're stage of life is all about pushing these boundaries and figuring out what they can and can't get away with. Like that's what they're supposed to be doing at this stage of their development. It would be unusual if they just obeyed every single guideline that was set in front of their face. And so it's really important as they're moving through this developmental stage of figuring out what they can get away with, what they can't get away with, what limits are important for them, that they bump up against some of those boundaries that actually have consequences. I hear a lot of parents who are fearful of implementing a consequence because then it may make things worse. It may make their depression worse or anxiety worse. Of course, I always encourage that these boundaries and consequences are accompanied with being able to earn privileges back, being able to extend resources, whether it's therapy or counsel at church or whoever might be a healthy therapeutic support for them to kind of work through some of these things. So it's not just a consequence and they have to deal with it on their own. But it's really important for them to bump up against these consequences, even if they're angry or upset, or even if they feel depressed after the consequence is implemented, as long as you get them the resources they need. So here's some examples. The first one is, I will not lie or call in sick for you. So you have a child who decides to get drunk at the Panthers game on Sunday, and he wants to call out of school on a Monday, and he asks you to write a note to the school. The boundary is, I'm not going to lie for you. I'm not going to call in sick for you. And that's my boundary. If you ask me to do that, or if you expect me to do that, I'm not going to do it. And if you're unable to attend school, you'll be responsible for the natural consequences. So that's an example that you don't even have to really do anything other than say no. Going back to this, I love this picture. Like, no is a complete sentence. We don't have to back up our no's as humans. We can just say, that's not comfortable for me. I'm not going to do that. Another boundary is, I will not allow drugs or alcohol use while you're living in my home. And if you are choosing to engage in alcohol or drug use, then I will not allow you to drive any of my vehicles. You'll be able to earn this privilege back once you test negative for all substances at a drug screening facility. So that's a great example of, there is a consequence if you drink or use in my house. You will not be able to drive vehicles. I do not feel comfortable knowing that you could potentially have a substance in your system and you are driving my vehicle, which then I am liable for. You could kill yourself or someone else. I don't feel comfortable with that. And so the only way you can earn that privilege back is if you test negative. But that's a really important thing for them to understand, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. They can earn that privilege back. I think, again, I talked about the parent who's really afraid to do the consequence because of the potential outcomes for their child or feelings their child might have. There's other sets of parents who are really strict with consequences and just say indefinitely these things are gone and there's no hope for the child. So then they just keep doing what they're doing, keep drinking or using, because they're never going to earn those things back anyways. So those are a few examples of boundaries and consequences. But just again, remember, boundaries are about you, not about them. It gives your child the autonomy to succeed or fail, and then it gives them the chance to learn how to kind of work through examples of failure in hopefully a safe and supportive environment within their family, because ultimately they're going to have to learn that one way or another in real life. There's going to be situations where they make a mistake or quote unquote fail in real life. And if they've had that opportunity to kind of wade through that within a family system, a more safe and supportive environment, they're going to be set up way more for success in the real world. Whether it's about drugs or alcohol or not, I think boundaries are really important for lots and lots of different things. They just definitely apply to drugs and alcohol. So making it really clear from the start and starting the conversation early. I've got a lot of parents who are starting this conversation at like 15, 16, 17, like going to junior prom, and we're having the conversation for the first time. We are way late if we are starting these conversations at that time. A lot of the kids that I am working with, the kid that I saw today, started drinking and using at 13. And he's not unusual. A lot of these kids are exposed to these things as early as middle school. We've got a 14-year-old coming to us with full-blown substance use disorder addiction because they're really being exposed to it at a young age. So my recommendation is that you start having these conversations with middle school students. So 6th, 7th, 8th grade, you're talking about your family history. You're talking about your boundaries, what is and is not acceptable for you. You're modeling the behaviors that you would like from them. So you're not too intoxicated in your house or having drugs and alcohol around all the times, those kinds of things. So starting early. And then if you get a 14-year-old who is starting to experiment, it's already set. We don't have to be reactive. I think that's the other really great thing about boundaries. A lot of family systems get locked into, like, when we catch you, then we have to have this big conversation and figure out what the consequences are. And Sometimes it's very reactive because we're very emotional, whether we feel disappointed or scared or upset or angry or whatever the feelings are, we're kind of reacting from that place of feeling and crisis and chaos. And so if we have these boundaries before anything ever happens, then we don't have to be quite as reactive because we know the guidelines have been set, the consequences have been set, and we're just going to follow through with what we said. And we can be pretty calm and consistent about that as opposed to getting locked into these chaotic cycles. Addiction thrives in chaos. So if as parents you are contributing to that chaos, addiction is like, yes, I can win this because I am smart and I will outsmart them, I will manipulate them, and I will continue to allow them to feel chaotic because that's ultimately going to hurt them. And that's what I need in order to thrive as addiction. Remaining united as a parental front, I think, is another really important and oftentimes really difficult things. As humans, we come from different backgrounds. We had different guidelines growing up. And so when we come into marriage, particularly if there's more than two parents or if there's grandparents involved in parenting, can be really difficult to get on and stay on the same page. But addiction is so good. And honestly, adolescents are so good at taking advantage of parental systems being on different pages. Sure, I see a lot of head nods. Like we can all kind of remember the most recent time that kiddo used one of us against the other, kind of got something from one of us that they didn't get from the other. And so one of the things that I encourage parents is if your child, again, whether it's drugs or alcohol involved, drugs and alcohol just kind of escalate these situations. But one of the things I encourage parents, if your child is coming to you, pressuring you for an answer, the answer is always, I'm not going to give you an answer until I consult with your other parent, always. If you feel pressured and you're unsure of how you feel in that moment, or you're unsure of how your partner would feel in that moment, it's always a, hey, we gotta chill. We will come back to you. And if it's got to happen right now, then it's not going to happen right now. So that pressure, that chaos is something that addiction really thrives on. So getting on the same page as much as humanly possible, especially about the big things, but arguably even about the little things. Do not provide alcohol and drugs to underage individuals. There's a lot of controversy about this. Ultimately, when I have parents sitting in my office, I always say, there is no perfect way of doing this. There just isn't. Some parents decide that if their kids are going to drink and use, it's safer for them to do it in their house. Some parents decide, absolutely no, you can't do it. There's really no perfect outcome. And regardless of your decision, you're not going to force your child to become an alcoholic or make sure that your child doesn't become an alcoholic. Unfortunately, we don't have that control as humans over other humans. However, my clinical recommendation is that you do not provide alcohol or drugs to your children or condone that use in your house. It's just a confusing message, right? If for 3 years we've been letting you drink in our home with your friends, and then all of a sudden we're freaking out because you're smoking pot every day and your grades are really bad, the child's brain can't sort that out very well. So the resistance to then getting help can be a lot stronger when the messages have been inconsistent. Keep prescription medications and alcohol out of reach, locked up, or out of the house. So if you have to have medications for yourself, or if you have another child who has ADD medications or something like that, just keeping them out of reach. I also encourage parents to limit the amount of cough syrup or nighttime medications that they have in their home. So things like NyQuil, things like Mucinex DM, Robitussin, these kinds of things have active ingredients in them that kids can get high off of. We're seeing a lot of kids in moments of desperation or just kind of wanting to be curious. The kid I saw today, he saw a TikTok video of someone who got high on Robitussin. He took a whole bunch of Mucinex DM pills and got really sick, and it was a terrible experience, but he was just curious, and it was in his house, so it was just so easy for him to go straight to. So just limiting the amount of those kinds of substances that you have in your house. If you need them, go get them just for what you need and then get rid of them. Walgreens has a great situation where if you have leftover medications, they have drop boxes, no questions asked. You just go to the pharmacy, put the medications in them, they dispose of them safely without putting them in the Charlotte water. If you flush them down the toilet, they end up in our water. So just put them in a Walgreens drop box, get rid of them safely if you don't need them anymore. And then I think the last thing is ask for professional help. Normalize that getting help is okay. I think, again, when I say like we wait until 16, 17 to have these conversations, we're way behind. We also wait until things are totally out of control to seek help. So if we're having like a little bit of difficulty with family communication, let's go ahead and seek counsel, whether that's in a church environment, whether that's in a therapeutic environment, whatever that looks like. Let's get some of that intervention on board early, because early intervention is very helpful and very important. If nothing else, to normalize more intensive help down the line. It may or may not curb the behaviors of substance use and abuse, but at least it demonstrates to the whole family system that we are going to get help when we need it. We're all going to be on board. We're all going to be a part of it. And it's okay if we need help. It's not a punishment for you to go to treatment or go to therapy or get help. It's just something that we do because we love you and we support you. So normalizing that professional help from early ages. So thank you. Can you go to the next one? Thank you. Okay. I'll kind of end on this and then open it up for questions. When I say help, that can be a really vast word and experience. There's lots and lots of different kind of help out there. I have a bunch of my cards, which I'll leave up here and you're welcome to take. I always encourage families, if there's any kind of mention of substance use or abuse, whether it's with an adolescent or an adult, whatever kind of family member, never hesitate to call Dilworth Center. That doesn't mean that you need us or that we're the appropriate level of care, but this is such a difficult world to navigate. And to kind of figure out what exactly you or your loved one or your family needs can be really difficult. Unfortunately, in the therapeutic community, both from treatment all the way down to individual therapy, there's a lot of really amazing people and places, and there's some really not great people and places, unfortunately. So we have, the longevity in Charlotte of having been here 33 years. We have a lot of partnerships and relationships with community members and support systems in the area. So never hesitate to call. Just in a phone call, a lot of times we can give you some resources and recommendations and help you navigate this. But just so you know, individual therapy oftentimes is the first line of defense. So again, if we're doing that early intervention thing, starting with an individual therapist that you're just meeting one-on-one, maybe a family therapist that you meet with a whole family together, couples therapist, and just kind of starting on a weekly basis, having a touch point, someone that you can talk to. I already mentioned psychological testing. So if you're concerned about your child having ADHD, reaching out to a psychologist, that's who does the psych testing. Again, we can give you recommendations if you need them. You can also call your insurance companies and they'll tell you who's in network with your insurance in the area. Psychiatrists prescribe medication. So they're the only one on this list that's going to give you medications if that's something you need. There are a lot of mental health medications out there that are really amazing. I talked about amphetamines and some of the dangers of them, but there's depression medications, anxiety medications that are really healthy and helpful and not addictive. So medication can be an amazing intervention. I just always plead families to not only do medication. Let's do therapy and medication. Let's make sure that we're getting the behavioral intervention in addition to the medical intervention. And then there's treatment centers like Dilworth Center. We're an outpatient treatment center here in Charlotte. Again, I mentioned we're private pay, private insurance, but we're in network with most major insurance companies or providers. We're a nonprofit, which is really awesome because we can give a lot of financial support if finances are a barrier to treatment for you or your family. And so we take everything really slow. We start with a really thorough assessment and evaluation process where we meet with parents and the adolescent separately. We will have met with you for probably 6 or 7 hours by the time that we're making any kind of recommendations, whether that's our program or a different program. So we're really kind of partnering with you as a family system to make sure that you are guided and getting the help that you need, whether it's us or not, because it's really important to have the appropriate interventions. Unfortunately, again, there are some interventions that can be more damaging than helpful. So reach out to trusted providers. Again, whether it's church council, whether it's us at Dilworth Center, whether you have therapists that you know and trust, seek guidance from those people. And then the last thing I'll say before questions is Al-Anon. So if you've never heard of Al-Anon, maybe you've heard of Alcoholics Anonymous AA meetings. These are all 12-step programs. So there's self-help groups, there's support groups. Many churches and other facilities including Dilworth Center around the area, offer their buildings on weeknights and weekdays and weekend nights and days for these meetings. They're just an hour long and they're completely free of charge. Al-Anon is for loved ones of people with addiction. So AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is for people with alcoholism. Al-Anon is for all of the loved ones of those people who belong in AA. And it's just a really amazing supportive community for people who are figuring out how to navigate being a loved one of someone who has addiction, whether that person is getting sober or not getting sober. Or maybe you're kind of at the starting point and you're realizing your child may be developing addiction and you just want some love, support, and guidance from people who have been through that. Al-Anon is a really amazing supportive community. You just Google Al-Anon Charlotte. The first link that comes up is the Charlotte meeting guide, and you can find meetings in the area. So just, again, an amazing support. If you're not quite ready to dive into treatment or therapy, that might be a stepping stone for you just to get in a community of people who understand what you're going through. Okay, I will pause there. I know I talked a lot. Hopefully it wasn't too fast or too much. What questions do you guys have?
I don't think, even if you don't think you have a problem in your house, do you still like hide all of the medications and all of that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. My encouragement is to have the least access possible, even if you're not concerned or don't think that there is a problem, because you just never know when they get that exposure or want to try something. I think that there is arguably a healthy modeling of moderate drinking, or having a glass of wine at dinner once a week, something like that, that is modeling that you can use something like alcohol and not have a problem with it. And so I think in terms of like getting all the alcohol out of your home, those kinds of things might be extreme measures. But in terms of medicine cabinets, I do really encourage families to have the least possible in medicine cabinets. And then of course, once you have knowledge that your child is taking your alcohol or is drinking or something like that, then kind of maybe notching it up to removing alcohol. A lot of times I will have families who will lock up all of their alcohol and think that that's an amazing intervention, and then the kid picks the lock. So I really encourage families, once a problem has started, to just remove it instead of lock it up. Good question. We have one on Zoom.
Is there a question on Zoom? Okay.
One thing I love is in restaurants these days, they have a lot of mocktail options.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that would be something we should encourage like older teenagers maybe to try, just so they know that's an option. I don't know, or not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on, like, there's no perfect way to do it, right? So certainly, I could argue some benefits of exposing children to the idea of mocktails. If you're going to events where you don't want to be the only one who doesn't have a drink in your hand, what can you have in your hand that synthesizes that feeling or that experience, but isn't alcohol? So some of those conversations could certainly be helpful to kind of prepare them for decision-making opportunities. I think in terms of like encouraging them to, it can cross the line into like the rituals of alcoholism. So for example, our patients, we actually strongly discourage mocktails because it just feels too similar to the rituals that they might have gone through when they were actually drinking. So I could argue positives and negatives. I think ultimately the biggest takeaway would be just talking to them about what could you have in your hand, what could you drink instead, that may not put a spotlight on you as the only one who's not drinking, but could give you something fun to drink or nice to drink that's not alcoholic. Good question.
So you talked about some of the substances, and we know that can be added to already existing drugs that are very dangerous. Can that also be incorporated into alcoholic beverages? Like if it's not even teens, if it's when they go off to college and they're handed something. I've always told my children, don't ever take anything from anybody, whatever age that is. But can those substances be added to alcoholic beverages as well? Right? Or more the point, have you heard of cases of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Yes. So, I mean, simply put, the answer is yes. One of the things that we saw a few years ago as a really big problem is people were putting Xanax in alcohol. So the benzodiazepines that I mentioned aren't a huge concern with adolescents, but basically benzodiazepines like Xanax, Klonopin, those kinds of things are alcohol in pill form. Our brain treats them almost identical. They're chemically almost identical. And so college students were realizing if they put a little Xanax in their alcohol, it made them drunker faster. They didn't have to drink as many calories, those kinds of things. But that turned into lacing alcoholic beverages without people knowing. And it's really easy to overdose on those chemicals combined because they're so similar. If you have too much, you end up with alcohol poisoning or overdosing. So great recommendation to never take a drink that you didn't pour yourself, and never leave your drink anywhere that you're not supervising it.
And can fentanyl be added to?
So technically fentanyl is just a powder. It's
Right.
just, so it can be added to literally anything. I haven't heard as much of fentanyl being put in beverages. I've heard more of it either being put in pressed pills. So things like Xanax that are sold on the market that aren't actually medical grade, or like sprinkled on marijuana, those kinds of things. You can say it over. You're good. I think on Zoom, yeah.
What is the rape date drug? What is that exactly?
So it's GHB is technically the chemical drug. Roofies, Rufalin is a lot of times what it's referred to. Honestly, another kind of good news, we haven't been hearing quite as much about GHB these days. I mean, there's, I guess, unfortunately, other drugs that are easier to access and can kind of produce similar effects in terms of like putting Xanax in the drink, those kinds of things. GHB was a really big concern, like back when I was in college 15 years ago, but it's not quite as big of a concern now. For now.
I needed a run. Yeah, there you go.
So for parties, for high schoolers, especially freshmen coming into high school, they want to go to these parties after dances. And, you know, parents are kind of shocked later to hear that there's a lot of alcohol
Yep.
at these parties, even if it's freshmen. So what is your recommendation for our children? Like, do we just say, no, you're not going to these parties? Or do we have the conversation to let them go and, you know, give them the right conversation? And what's the most important thing to say to them if you're going to let them go?
Yeah, so I really think that comes back to the boundary conversation. I think it's really important to give our adolescents the opportunity to make choices, whether that's a healthy choice or an unhealthy choice, but guiding them in that and explaining to them what is and is not acceptable for your household. So having those conversations before of, you know, this is what's allowed, this is what's not allowed, this is why I have these boundaries. And if you fall outside of those boundaries, there will be consequences. Whether you tell them exactly what those consequences are or not is up to you, but just making it really clear to them kind of what your boundary is. Because ultimately, if we don't let them go to the party in high school, they're going to go to the party after high school and maybe not have those tools. So it really sets them up for success long term if we're having those conversations and boundaries and letting them have some experiences where they get to then make choices and figure out every choice that we make, every behavior that we have has a consequence. Some consequences are really positive. Some consequences are really negative, you know, and so that's scary as a parent, you know, kind of letting them have some of that space to make unhealthy choices, but those conversations can be really helpful. I think it's also really important as parents to know that those conversations don't necessarily produce the results that we want them to produce. And so if we're talking about consequences, if we're setting specific consequences, they need to be consequences that we are actually going to enforce. So like I hear a lot of parents who are coming to me, which, you know, I'm working with more extreme cases of substance use and abuse, but they have threatened to kick their child out of their house 7 times. But they're never actually going to follow through with that. It is just a threat. It is not a real consequence, and their child knows that. So for example, if the boundary is, I want you to have fun and be able to go to parties, our boundary is there's no drinking or drug use while you're here. So we're going to be drug testing you on Monday after the weekend, and if we learn of any substance use or abuse, you're going to lose your phone and your car for the next 2 weeks and until you test negative. You have to actually do that. And you can't give their phone back at the halfway point or before they test negative. You know, you got to actually follow through with it. There's still that piece of hope that they're going to be able to earn it back, but you have to be really consistent with those consequences.
I've got one question. So if you have a under 18-year-old that shares information with you that they haven't shared, obviously haven't shared with their parents, are you obliged to share that with the parents?
That's a tricky one. It depends. So I'm a mandated reporter, meaning if they tell me something that's going to cause them or someone else immediate harm, I have to tell. As just a community member, I think it really depends on the situation. My goal, at least in my role as a therapist, or like I have a family I've babysat for literally their whole life. I stayed with them this weekend. He's 17 now. So we were just chit-chatting and he was talking to me about alcohol use. In that situation, my goal was to motivate him to talk to his mom about it. So it wasn't a situation where I said, I'm going to go run and tell your mom, because in that situation, he wasn't in harm's way. Like he was just kind of grappling with this concept. And so the conversation was more just like, I really think your parents would benefit from having this conversation with you. What do you think about that? How would that look for you? If at some point it continued and I felt like his parents needed to know, then I would tell him. But that's probably more the modality I would take. But I think it depends, right? So if you know that that child, that 18-year-old or 17-year-old is buying fentanyl from a drug dealer, absolutely we got to tell their parents, right? If it's that they're thinking about drinking at a party on the weekends, you know, may or may not be something that we run to their parents about.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much, Kelly, for being
Yeah,
with us.
thank you guys. Like I said, I'm gonna leave my cards up here if you want to take one.
Thank you for everybody that's on Zoom.